провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Now, you may not know it now, but America is already at war with China and Russia.
Il giudizio che gli americani hanno dato e danno sulla Russia, sulla Cina, è un giudizio profondamente sbagliato. Pensano di essere noi, europei. Pensiamo di essere ancora al centro del mondo.
You were still invested in a Chinese state oil company that was doing business with the Iranian oil sector.
The fact of the matter is that the center of global gravity has shifted from the West exclusively to some sort of uncertain balance between the West and the East.
Nous avons vécu après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale dans ce qu'on appelait l'équilibre de la terreur entre l'Est et l'Ouest. L'équilibre de la terreur, c'était de la terreur nucléaire, puisque chacun des deux blocs s'affrontait, mais n'osait faire la guerre à cause de l'impossibilité de la faire à partir du moment où on détient l'arme nucléaire, qui a donc empêché une nouvelle guerre mondiale. Ceci a perduré jusqu'à la fin des années 80 et à partir de 1990, l'URSS a explosé. Mikhail Gorbatchev ayant essayé de modifier, moderniser l'URSS, mais n'y est pas parvenu. Donc l'URSS a explosé, s'est ouverte au libéralisme avec Boris Yeltsin et l'Amérique a bien entendu encouragé.
Вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Be sure you get the right attribution there.
Я надеюсь, что вы правильно все это поняли.
After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the dream of U.S. hegemony began to germinate in the minds of American politicians and many international analysts. But many steps needed to be taken and many hurdles removed forever.
Mr. Yeltsin has just handed me a summary of a cabinet meeting, but I haven't read it yet.
Well, go ahead and read it then.
Si bien que, à partir de 1990, l'Amérique n'avait plus d'opposants dans le monde. La Russie, l'URSS n'existait plus. La Russie était complètement désorganisée et faible. Et au contraire demandait l'aide de l'Amérique. Donc l'Amérique est d'un seul coup devenue l'unique puissance mondiale. Et elle a jugé que c'était son devoir, et parfois de façon très sincère pour certains, d'apporter la liberté et l'humanisme au monde entier, sans tenir compte des différences de culture dans le monde.
Non è capace di confrontarsi con culture profonde e storiche. Questo è molto importante. Il giudizio che gli americani hanno dato e danno sulla Russia, o sulla Cina, o sull'Iran, è un giudizio profondamente sbagliato. E questo conduce a errori di prospettiva, a scelte sbagliate, a equivoci. Quindi è molto importante, quando si parla con gli Stati Uniti, ma anche quando si parla con i tedeschi, o con i francesi, o con gli italiani, con gli europei, bisogna che gli altri tengano conto che l'impero cambia la mentalità della gente. Pensano di essere noi, europei. Pensiamo di essere ancora al centro del mondo.
Bush ha impostato il suo mandato su un concetto strategico che alla fine era ben chiaro, enunciato abbastanza anche dai think tank, i pensatori neoconservatori, quindi a lui legati. Ossia che gli Stati Uniti, per preservare il ruolo di potenza, di grande potenza egemone a livello mondiale, dovessero riuscire a impedire qualsiasi ascesa di potenziali rivali, e che questo dovesse avvenire principalmente tramite l'affermazione militare degli Stati Uniti.
The US had many causes for concern. It was worried about de facto powers such as Europe and Japan, and potential powers like Russia and China. Therefore, it needed to take measures to hinder those countries or regions. The Greater Middle East region has two nuclear-armed states, Pakistan and India. At the same time, Russia, North Korea, and China in the north and east each have access to nuclear power.
All'interno di questa idea strategica complessiva è stato poi elaborato il progetto del Grande Medio Oriente, ossia di una risistematizzazione di tutta quell'area che va dal Marocco fino anche all'Asia centrale potenzialmente. Appunto quell'area fragile perché fortemente frammentata, che sta in mezzo alle aree più forti dove possono venire potenziali minacce all'egemonia globale degli Stati Uniti, e che quindi permette di controllarle tutte, anche per la questione ovviamente del petrolio e del gas, importante per molti di questi paesi.
A 4-star U.S. Army General Wesley Clark. Have you heard that name before? Mr. Clark said Wolfowitz, the neocon architect of Bush's war on Iraq, told him of plans to clean out the Middle East and take over those Muslim nations. Just 10 days after 9/11, Clark was shown a Pentagon memo that describes how they planned to take out 7 countries, Muslim countries, in 5 years, starting with Iraq, then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and then Iran. They call this project the Greater Middle East Project.
U.S. military invasions of the Middle East were the first steps taken to realize its hegemonic goals in the framework of the Greater Middle East Project. The U.S. presented the project once on June 8, 2003 by George Bush in a meeting of the heads of states in the U.S., and once by Dick Cheney in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. The purpose of the project was stated as promoting growth and progress in the Middle East in such spheres as democracy, education, and economy.
Civilized people must do everything in our power to defeat terrorism and to stop the spread of weapons of mass destruction. These tasks that we face are tasks that we'll face far into the future. And our success will depend on meeting three fundamental responsibilities. First, we must confront the ideologies of violence at the source by promoting democracy throughout the greater Middle East and beyond.
Ho già accennato prima a questo problema. Gli Stati Uniti continuano a pensare che il mondo andrà avanti nei prossimi decenni come loro hanno deciso. E questi progetti di potenza sono gli stessi progetti di prima, cioè loro pensano di poter, come dire, conquistando le risorse energetiche e controllando il pianeta dal punto di vista energetico, saranno in condizioni di mantenere il potere. Quindi, per esempio, è molto importante controllare il petrolio iraniano, perché il petrolio iraniano va anche in Cina, perché il petrolio iraniano va anche in India. E loro vogliono controllare non solo il petrolio che va negli Stati Uniti o in Europa, vogliono controllare il petrolio che serve tutti gli altri paesi, compresi i potenziali avversari.
The U.S. underwent the harrowing experience of the Arab oil embargo of 1973. The Arab states did it to express their objection to the U.S. support of Israel. It was then when they realized that controlling the oil could be a trump card in international relations. Up to now, the U.S. has succeeded in controlling the quality and quantity of the oil provided to its rivals. It's also reduced or cut their oil shipment whenever necessary to reach its own goals. The successful implementation of the Greater Middle East Project has helped the U.S. keep its political and economic domination over the region. It's also contributed to absolute control over three strategic transport routes: the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the entrance of the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean, and the Strait of Gibraltar in North Africa at the entrance of the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic Ocean between Spain and Morocco. At the same time, the strategic Suez Canal comes under U.S. control as well.
Quindi se guardiamo questo quadro e lo confrontiamo con l'attuale fisionomia del pianeta e la crisi che sta investendo tutto l'Occidente, noi capiamo che la cosa sta diventando molto pericolosa. Perché? Perché Europa e Stati Uniti non hanno le risorse e vogliono le risorse e vogliono il controllo assoluto e totale delle risorse.
Il Medio Oriente è una posizione strategica perché collega, è la cerniera che collega l'Europa, l'Eurasia, quindi la zona della Russia dei vicini, l'Asia orientale e l'Africa, quindi un'importante cerniera. Sta al centro della massa continentale che è quella euro-afroasiatica, che in tutta la teorizzazione geopolitica, quindi strategia americana, ha un ruolo centrale. Gli americani già da diversi decenni teorizzano la necessità di riuscire a controllare la massa eurasiatica in quanto centro della politica mondiale e ritengono che per farlo sia necessario controllare il suo margine, in quanto controllando il margine riescono a neutralizzare la potenza centrale, che è quella rappresentata sostanzialmente dalla Russia, ma occasionalmente
Except for Russia, which has rich oil and gas reserves, all the rivals of the U.S. in economy and industry are somehow dependent on the Middle East's energy carriers. Any change in oil exports not only influences the U.S. and its policies, but also directly affects the economy and policies of its rivals. An oil embargo cannot be imposed on Russia, but damaging hurdles can be created for its energy exports. The U.S. presence in Central Asia and the Caspian Sea region can create serious problems for Russia's energy exports and economy in general. That way, once America's biggest enemy and national security threat can be kept at bay.
Спасибо всем, кто сказал «да» великой России. Я вас спросил однажды, мы победим? Мы победили!
Et dire que la campagne d'Afghanistan était pour l'élimination d'Al-Qaïda et autres, je pense que c'est un leurre. Je pense que c'est pas du tout le problème. Le problème, c'est dans le mythe américain d'isoler de plus en plus la Russie. En fait, l'Afghanistan, Turkménistan et toutes les bases qui ont été créées dans les anciennes républiques russes du sud de la Russie, de l'ancienne URSS, sud et sud-est. En fait, les Américains ont profité de la guerre d'Afghanistan pour faire de multiples bases dans ces pays-là, Ouzbékistan, Turkménistan. Et c'était une façon d'isoler de plus en plus le géant russe, qui ne puisse plus jamais recréer une Union soviétique, même qui ne serait pas soviétique, mais une autre union. Voilà, c'est un but mythique des Américains, c'est un reste de l'époque Reagan, c'est un reste du rêve américain des années 80, du siècle dernier.
There is simply no room for Russia, not politically, not militarily, not culturally. There's no place for Russia in this system. Because the fate of Russia, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski, is to be broken up. There's a Brzezinski plan for Russia, which says, you know, we like Russia so much, we want there to be 10 of them.
Where Russia is concerned, the U.S. activities in the republics of Central Asia and the Caucasus can be considered. The Velvet Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, subversive attempts to break up Russia by supporting separatists in the North Caucasus, and NATO's advance towards the East are but a few examples.
Sooner or later, Georgia will become a member of NATO, and in 3-4 years will have a well-developed economy. The most important for Georgia is to remain unprovoked.
And the West's readiness to let Georgia and Ukraine into NATO is all aimed at weakening Russia.
NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO.
We're the first armed forces in the post-Soviet space to acquire Western weapons and adopt Western standards at such a pace. I couldn't even imagine that we would be able to do it.
Alors je peux continuer si vous voulez, à moins que vous vouliez une autre... donc, si vous voulez, actuellement, il y a un bouleversement des équilibres mondiaux. Justement, la fin de la désagrégation de la Syrie depuis les années 2000 et l'arrivée de Poutine au pouvoir, donc la montée en puissance de la Russie qui a commencé à mettre un holà aux avancées américaines en direction de ses marches, de ses frontières, puisque contrairement à ce qui avait été promis, l'OTAN, le bras armé de l'Amérique, s'est emparé peu à peu de toutes les anciennes républiques d'Europe centrale et d'Europe de l'Est qui étaient sous obédience soviétique du temps de l'URSS. Et donc la Russie s'est sentie de plus en plus enfermée et elle a donné un holà qui est très important, je pense. C'est en août 2008, lorsque elle est intervenue en Géorgie pour empêcher que la Géorgie ne bascule complètement dans le camp américain. Elle l'est dans le camp américain, mais la Russie, en intervenant militairement, a dit à l'Amérique, attention, maintenant vous ne pouvez pas aller au-delà.
Today, Russia has launched a full-scale military invasion of Georgia.
When Russia attacked Georgia in 2008, Europe didn't take any action against it despite Georgia's importance, and made do with only a verbal condemnation.
It has been started by irresponsible decision of the Georgian president. The West has to understand that it should be blamed, and we should find the way out of that situation.
The Middle East is situated in the vicinity of the U.S. rivals, namely China and Russia, and nuclear-armed countries like India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Therefore, if the U.S. succeeds in dominating the Middle East, it can increase pressure on those countries.
Il y a d'autres pouvoirs qui sont en train de se développer, qui ont des bases économiques solides. Je pense à la Chine, je pense à l'Inde, je pense à la Russie, je pense au Brésil. Tous ces pays dépendent de moins en moins des Américains et sont de plus en plus autonomes et de plus en plus capables de défendre leurs propres intérêts.
As I said before, we've put in the toughest, most crippling sanctions ever. And the fact is, while we were coordinating an international coalition to make sure these sanctions were effective, you were still invested in a Chinese state oil company that was doing business with the Iranian oil sector.
Representative Mike Rogers is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, and he's out front tonight. Chairman, good to see you as always. And I mean, I guess the hope still, it seemed from both the president and the governor, is that sanctions will work. And that's why I wanted to ask you this, because one thing that sort of is shocking is that the top 4 buyers of Iranian crude oil are still buying it. We're talking about Japan, China, India, and Korea. And they're doing it with the blessing of the U.S. State Department. China is now buying half of Iran's daily output. So yes, sanctions have hurt them. Yes, their oil exports have plunged. But the biggest buyers are still buying. And I'm wondering why that is, that the U.S. government gives those free passes. Is it because we just can't get China to do what we want?
Well, China is certainly not going to cooperate with the United States in any way on Iran. They have other deals there, so they need that petroleum. Remember, China has to grow at about 8% a year just to meet their social demands on their government spending. So they're not going to pay attention to us. Russia has also not been very helpful, so they're not going to help us.
And now people are even speculating about the possibility of not only rivalry, but a kind of hostility, pervasive, embracing the entire relationship.
What role does Russia play in the relationship between the United States and China?
Mr. Putin seems tempted to play the China card against us if he can. I think the pivoting to Asia makes sense generally, simply because Asia has emerged as an important force in world affairs. And this is not just China, but China, of course, is preeminent together with Japan. And we have to balance the new geopolitical realities. The fact of the matter is that the center of global gravity has shifted from the West exclusively to some sort of uncertain balance between the West and the East.
Perché la crisi del pianeta è diventata così grande che è quasi impossibile pensare che nel corso dei prossimi 20-25 anni la Cina, l'India, il Brasile, la Turchia, l'Indonesia possano condividere le risorse del pianeta con gli Stati Uniti d'America. E siccome gli Stati Uniti d'America sono il paese più armato del pianeta, io credo che quando apparirà chiaro che le risorse sono limitate e che gli Stati Uniti hanno la forza, credo che gli Stati Uniti faranno la guerra.
Attacking Iran is probably one of the U.S. options on the table. In such a dire situation, the price of oil will increase, and those countries trying to meet their needs will have two options: either to go to war, which will make the situation even worse, or to use their foreign exchange reserves to pay for more expensive oil. Countries with high foreign exchange reserves like China, South Korea, and Japan are probably more capable of purchasing oil at a higher price. In that case, they will leave their rivals behind and weaken them at the same time. According to the estimates of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, every $15 increase in the price of oil will decrease economic growth in industrialized countries by about 0.5% per year. If that problem occurs, the West's economy will be destroyed, leading in some cases to political collapse. That's because they're incapable of competitive purchase of oil compared to their main rivals like China, Japan, and South Korea. In such a situation, the U.S. will either have to end the war and leave the region, or remain there. The former option will bring about a destiny similar to that of Britain and the Soviet Union. The U.S. will lose its position forever and provide a chance for the development of its enthusiastic rivals, especially China and Russia, and even some European countries. If the U.S. chooses the latter option, it will bring a full-fledged political and economic self-mutilation upon itself.
Il y a également la montée d'autres puissances comme la Chine, l'Inde et bien d'autres, de plus en plus, qui font que l'ensemble du monde voit émerger de nouveaux pôles de puissance et qu'on est entré dans un monde multipolaire.
E quindi è molto illusoria l'idea. Procuriamoci tutte le risorse possibili, prendiamole dovunque, perché era possibile solo fino a che gli Stati Uniti erano un impero. Un impero è quando l'imperatore può decidere e nessuno può contestare la sua decisione. Ma ormai non è più così, perché adesso gli Stati Uniti non sono più in grado di decidere per conto della Cina, per esempio. La Cina può fare quello che vuole e sta facendo quello che vuole. E quindi l'impero è finito. Fine.
China is now developing economically very fast. They need huge quantities of imported oil. They really ought to build many more nuclear reactors. They're building 25. They should probably build 250 of the most modern nuclear reactors. But instead, they got this oil dependency. Ultimately, the US and the British need to deal with Russia and China, and they know this.
Because I don't think that at this stage we need to engage in a deliberate policy of formulating either formal or informal alliances, a web of alliances directed at China.
Et actuellement, il y a quand même la Russie et la Chine qui sont en train de prendre un leadership. La Russie et la Chine ont surtout conquis leur indépendance en opposant leur droit de veto au bombardement sur la Syrie. Là, ils sont revenus sur le devant de la scène, politiquement. Ils l'étaient déjà économiquement, surtout la Chine, mais maintenant, ils sont devenus sur la scène politiquement. Et puis le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU.
Today, 2 members have vetoed a vastly watered-down text that doesn't even mention sanctions.
On en a un exemple, si vous voulez, avec la Syrie. Je trouve que la Syrie est un exemple typique également. C'est une pierre d'achoppement, je pense, de nouvel édifice multipolaire qui va exister dans le monde. Ils se sont aperçus qu'ils n'arrivaient pas à déboulonner ce régime qui ne leur était pas favorable. Et ils ont compris que la seule possibilité, c'était une intervention militaire. Or, encore aujourd'hui, j'espère que ça le restera, je pense d'ailleurs, ils ont compris qu'aucune intervention militaire n'était possible en Syrie parce que les autres puissances multipolaires, les multipôles qui dirigent ce monde, s'y opposaient fermement car elles avaient bien compris aussi que en attaquant la Syrie, c'était elle-même qui était au second degré menacée. La Chine, la Russie ont été très nettes sur l'interdiction d'une intervention militaire et je pense qu'il n'y aura pas de possibilité d'intervention militaire en Syrie.
I don't think Russia and China believe they are paying any price at all, nothing at all, for standing up on behalf of the Assad regime.
Donc, la Syrie montre aussi, comme la Géorgie en 2008, la Syrie en 2011, 2012, montre que le monde unipolaire dirigé par l'Amérique est terminé et que désormais, il faudra que l'Amérique s'habitue à entrer dans un monde multipolaire.
Last month, China vetoed a UN Security Council resolution on the crisis in Syria. This resolution arguably was less robust than a February security resolution on Libya that China approved. How should we interpret these two votes, and what do they tell us about China's evolving role on the Security Council?
I think what they say is that the Chinese have a very different view than we have of repression by governments. I think the Chinese have this notion that ultimately sovereignty, national sovereignty, means what the word sovereignty implies. On this, we have a legitimate and serious difference of view, a philosophical difference. And having a decent relationship with an important country, in this case we're talking about China, doesn't mean that we have to abandon our principles. But it also means, as a practical matter, that we have to make judgments regarding how effective can simply protestations or condemnations be.
The US has acknowledged China's influence and superiority in East Asia, but it's still trying to weaken and dominate this economic power. Therefore, it has focused on strategic regions, for example, Afghanistan, that's between China, Iran, and North Korea. If we look at the US maneuvers in Europe and Asia, we'll see that the US has positioned its forces in Japan, Southeast Asia, South Korea, Pakistan, and the waters near China. The purpose is to surround China.
Biggest single problem of China is they need oil. They would need to have a corridor, a pipeline, going from Iran, Iraq, some version of that, up through Pakistan. The words for this are Pipelinistan, that's Pakistan, or the Pakistan Energy Corridor. So what's the US approach to that? This is contained in Obama's West Point speech of December 2009. So they break up Pakistan, and at that point there will never be a pipeline from Iran to China.
All in all, America's economic situation is dire. Its debt is high and its budget deficit equals $1.5 trillion. The country has adopted an expansionary monetary policy and low interest rates and artificially reduced the value of the dollar to deal with China. China, America's main rival now, intensifies this crisis by pursuing its economic policies, especially by keeping the yuan at artificially low levels in order to have low production costs and more exports. In such a situation, the US cannot compete against China in the economic arena because of its high production costs.
If they could close the Straits of Hormuz, they'd like to do that. China would have no oil. What would China do? According to various US scenarios, China would have to attack Russia. It would have to attack Russia to seize the oil of Siberia and save itself that way. Now that would be a world war. The Sino-Russian war, one scenario I've seen is this is supposed to happen in 2021, but with the scenario that I've said. So they would destroy each other. The Anglo-Americans would sit back and laugh and have another 100 years of world domination.
Notamment la renaissance de la Russie, qui est un fait très, très important. Les exigences de la Chine, qui sont calmes, qui n'intervient pas militairement, encore pour le moment en tout cas, pour défendre ses intérêts ou imposer ses vues. Mais tout ça fait qu'on est vraiment déjà dans un monde multipolaire. L'Amérique l'a compris et elle pense à s'occuper, à se retirer, à arrêter l'interventionnisme dans l'ensemble du monde.
China and Russia's military power strongly influences regional affairs. For example, North Korea, one of China's allies, is constantly under US-led pressure and sanctions. Tensions between North Korea, South Korea, and the US came to a boiling point after Washington and Seoul's joint military exercises. North Korea then threatened the US with nuclear attack. Kim Young-chun, Minister of People's Armed Forces, accused South Korea of preparing for war because war weapons were used in those exercises. He also announced that his country was ready to start a holy war based on nuclear deterrence against South Korea. North Korea's development of nuclear weapons has turned this country into a serious threat to the US. The range of North Korea's missiles enables them to target all the US bases in the region, and even some of its important cities and locations. This shows that if a global conflict occurs, the US will be threatened on many fronts and by many countries.
Ce qui fait que l'Amérique ne peut plus dicter sa loi au monde comme elle le faisait avant, car il y a d'autres pôles de puissance qui ont des intérêts qui sont divergents de ceux de l'Amérique et qui donc ne laisseront plus l'Amérique intervenir partout et diriger ses affaires comme elle l'a fait jusqu'à présent.
If we consider the two world wars destructive to the entire world, we have to exclude the US from this rule. After World War II, the US had come almost to no harm. Finding Europe weak and powerless, it started to envisage a stronger role for itself in the world. The Americanization theory is based on Marshall McLuhan's theory of global village. According to McLuhan, the whole world is like a village inclined towards a higher structure. This structure has almost uniform social, economic, cultural, and political dimensions. The Americans consider it liberal democracy. In other words, the US attempt to rule the world is rooted in globalization. Neil Ferguson, historian and professor of history at Harvard University, believes that political globalization is just a fancy word for imposing one's views and practices on others.
Because we're talking about world domination. We're not talking about any regional question. This is now world power, world domination, the thing, you know, what Hitler and Napoleon strove for, and what the Anglo-Americans have today and have had for more than a century. This is now what's at stake. So it's a big game on a big chessboard.
The ultimate goal of the United States is to take the resources of Africa and Middle East under military control in order to block economic growth in China and Russia, thus taking the whole of Eurasia under control. Now, you may not know it now, but America is already at war with China and Russia.
E cioè che le risorse non sono illimitate, le risorse del pianeta, e che il meccanismo, il metodo, il sistema economico e sociale degli Stati Uniti non potrà continuare all'infinito, perché le risorse petrolifere, petrolio, gas, carbone, si esauriranno nel corso della prima metà di questo secolo. Molto semplice.
Moi, je pense que l'Amérique a compris que désormais, elle ne pouvait plus diriger le monde, qu'il y avait d'autres puissances émergentes qui avaient des conceptions et des intérêts divergents avec elle.
Нечто такое, что, мне кажется, должно подталкивать наших коллег и наших партнеров к более конструктивной работе, чем до сих пор мы это видим. Что я имею в виду? Совсем недавно, совсем несколько лет назад, лично нам не говорили, но я знаю, что они говорили своим, говорили, ладно, пускай там Россия ковыряется, нам уже даже не очень интересно. У них там ржавчина одна осталась. Это не так. Сегодня это уже совсем...
Et donc, elle va essayer de trouver un modus vivendi, comme on dit en latin, c'est-à-dire une façon de vivre avec ses intérêts divergents le plus apaisé possible, si vous voulez, que ces forces s'équilibrent paisiblement sans déclencher de conflit.
After my election, I have more flexibility. I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and my stand with him.